good evening, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be going over the brief history and geography of Eritrea. This is going to be another one-off because I don't have any extras to show you. So let's just get right into it. There's my pencil. So Eritrea is located in Eastern Africa, right about on the Horn of Africa, would be down here. This is the Red Sea up here. And Eritrea borders Sudan on this side. It borders Ethiopia over here. And has a little border here with Djibouti. So as you can imagine, being on the Red Sea, it's got this long coastline. And in terms of climate, their coastal region is way hotter than their inland region. It's considered one of the hottest places on Earth, actually. But they do have some major port cities on the coast. This is Massawa. This is Aseb or Asab. And Eritrea also owns these islands out here, the Dahlak archipelago. There are about 124 islands in the archipelago, but only 4 are inhabited. There's like a marine refuge, lots of really interesting preserved wildlife on the islands and in the water here. As we move further into Eritrea, in this big region up here, it's completely different from around the coast, which is very hot, rocky, very arid, almost desert-like. Desertification is something that is threatening Eritrea, but we're going to touch on that toward the end of its history. But this region in here has very, very beautiful rainforests. It's considered a subtropical rainforest. Lots of really beautiful cliffs, mountains. The highest point being right here. It is Emba Soira. And, basically what you really need to know about Eritrean geography is it's hot and arid, cool and lush. It's pretty much the basics. In terms of plate tectonics, however, I did a really interesting atlas reading video where I read about tectonic plates and read about how Africa is slowly splitting apart. And that is happening right around Eritrea. It's 3 plates coming together. They meet up right about here. And it's the basis of where Africa is starting to split apart. Basically, the whole Horn of Africa, in about 10 million years or so, is going to break off from mainland Africa. It's called the East African Rift. And really interesting, I think. I always wondered, how do we know what the Earth is going to look like? We know what it looked like millions of years ago. What will it look like in a million years? And that's one of the things, is that this whole chunk of Africa is going to break off. I think that's interesting. Humans will probably not be around for that, so it's nothing to worry about. The capital city is right here, Asmara, which we'll talk about in its history, of course. Keren is another important city. It was the site of a famous battle in Eritrea's history. But like I said, this is going to be a brief history. Eritrea does have a very long and interesting history in terms of tribal leaders, kings, even emperors, but we're not going to get into too much detail into those. So let's just dive right in. Another interesting fact about Eritrea is that in this country, the bones of one of the oldest hominid links between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens was found mostly in this area right here. If you know the bones of Lucy, one of the most famous links was found right around here in Ethiopia. So in this area, pretty much at the dawn of human existence, it's where we most likely evolved from, erectus to sapiens. think it's really interesting. As we know, in terms of human history, humans as we know ourselves today began in Africa and moved out toward, Europe, Asia, spreading out eventually down into North America and South America. And it's believed that this area was one of the places where people traveled up into, into what we know as, what would eventually become Mesopotamia, what have you. Those human links that have been found are over 1 million years old. That's really interesting. There's so many ancient sites in Eritrea. The earliest signs of human settlement come from around 8000 BCE, things like fishing hooks and basic tools. There were many different, like I mentioned in the beginning, ancient kingdoms and things like that. But what is really interesting, if you know your Egyptian history, it's possibly where the land of Punt was. I mean, there is a big section of Somalia called Punt land down here. It's believed that this whole Horn of Africa area could have been Punt. So for those who aren't obsessed with Egyptology, the ancient Egyptians wrote almost extensively about a land that they traded with called Punt. They drew pictures of people from Punt trading with them. They made lists of, the gold and treasures and animals they traded with Punt. They wrote about traveling to Punt, but the one thing they didn't write down was where Punt was. So we still have no idea, but the number one most logical theory is that it is in this Horn of Africa region. I think that's really cool. It's one of the mysteries that will never be solved in history. Maybe one stele or something will be discovered somewhere that says, oh, here's how to get to Punt, but most likely not. So the first big kingdom to rise up in what is now Eritrea was called Dimt. It rose to prominence between the 10th and 5th centuries BCE. And there are many remnants of this kingdom. They built a lot of temples. They had their own form of irrigation and plowing. They made tools and weapons with iron. But eventually they were absorbed into the Aksum Empire, which is the empire we're going to talk about when we cover Ethiopia down here, because that's where it really rose to prominence and where it got started and where it was led from. But the thing to take away about the Aksum Empire, like the one fact that every historian knows about Aksum, was that they accepted Christianity and spread it around this area. And one of the oldest monasteries ever was built in what is now Eritrea. It's called Debrecena. After Aksum started to decline, they became part of an empire known as Medjugorje, which is the one thing that we're not going to get into because I could go off in a tangent about all of the leaders and how their culture worked, so we're just going to leave it at that so we don't go too far into details. In 1517, Medjugorje was conquered by the Ottomans. They were still allowed to have power. It was just like a small piece of the Ottoman Empire, but they still ruled it themselves. And it wasn't long after that the territory had their first European contact in 1520 from the Portuguese, and they actually wound up building a very small colony right around here. But as with most Portuguese explorations around Africa, they fell apart. And once when other powers came into prominence in the African trade, so on and so forth, it's a whole long history about what happened to the age of Portuguese exploration and navigation. That's for another video. So then the Ottomans attempted to expand their territory here in Africa in 1559. They were met with a lot of resistance from Medjugorje and peoples this way, and fought back. And the Ottomans would try again, and they would fight back, push the Ottomans back. Eventually, they forced the Ottomans out of the territory around the start of the 16th century. Now, jumping to the scramble for Africa, which I've basically mentioned in like all of my Africa videos because it's important for the entire continent. It was when all of the major European powers got together and decided what parts of Africa they were going to have. basically literally a scramble, just picking different parts of Africa. And this is another thing where I could go into more detail, but I'm just going to wrap it up in a little bow and say, long story short, Italy went out in this area. The borders, most of the borders as we know it today, was established during this time, and it became known as Italian Eritrea in 1890. Now, the name Eritrea is the Greek word for Red Sea. Pretty sure, or at least it comes from the Greek word for Red Sea, if not exactly. The Europeans referred to this area as that, thanks to the ancient Greeks. And when it came time to name the territory, they just stuck with it, being European after all. The Italians, once they came into prominence here, built a lot of things. The most famous thing they built were railroads, and they built a big one here from Massawa to Asmara, which this was the capital at first, and then as the development here grew and grew, they moved to the capital here. They built many factories so that not only could, the Italians could get some profit, but also would give them more jobs and, provide manufactured goods for the people of Eritrea as well. They improved a lot of the infrastructure. They revamped their whole agriculture sector, improved their economy. But also the Eritreans were conscripted into the Italian military. So whenever the Italians fought wars, the Eritreans were fighting for them, no matter what. In 1922, Benito Mussolini was in charge of Italy, and he created a new territory here in Africa called Italian East Africa. So he combined Italian Eritrea and Italian Somalia that they owned with their recent conquest of Ethiopia and created a great big little Italian nation. And it was during the 1930s that Asmara got a really interesting facelift in that they built some absolutely gorgeous Art Deco Italian style buildings. Simply beautiful. They're a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, to be preserved forever, because they're really striking architecture. It's very beautiful. But then World War II happens, right? So Britain came in, fought that Battle of Keren I told you about, and eventually conquered Eritrea in 1941. And they controlled it until 1950, holding on to it just to figure out what to do with it. So the British and the Americans got together at the UN to talk about what to do with Eritrea, and they really wanted to cede most of it over to Ethiopia. The Eritreans themselves repeatedly asked for an independence referendum and independence votes, so on and so forth, but they weren't given that, and eventually Eritrea came under Ethiopian federal control. So Eritrea was allowed to have its own parliament and police force, what have you, but it would all be under the thumb of Ethiopia. So, because of that, in 1958, the Eritrean Liberation Movement, or the ELM, was formed, and they were more of a clandestine, in the shadows movement to try to get independence from Ethiopia. But in 1961, the Eritrean Liberation Front was formed, or the ELF, and they were the opposite. They were all about the guerrilla warfare, armed battles, fighting physically against Ethiopia. And it sparked the Eritrean War for Independence, which lasted until 1991. And I always say on this channel that we don't get into the horrible details of things, and we're not going to talk about what happened. Let's just say that there is an entire Wikipedia page of massacres during this war, just to give you an idea of how horrible it was for the civilians caught in the middle. But eventually the ELF managed to raid Addis Ababa. Oh, I don't think you can see it here, the capital of Ethiopia. Nope, it's out of screen. And demanded independence. They were allowed to have an independence vote finally in 1993, and they were granted independence. They were their own country. And a man named Isaias Afwerki was elected president. And put a pin in him because we're going to get back to him in just a second. So now that Eritrea is its own country, they needed to define their borders with Ethiopia. And it was very vague around here and all around here. And it led to another war, to put it bluntly, from 1998 to 2000. Another really horrible, tens of thousands losing their lives during this war. But that one ended in a stalemate. It ended in a lot of UN negotiations. And it eventually was resolved with a peace treaty in 2018. And now you can see the clearly defined borders. So back to Isaias Afwerki. When he was elected in 1993, that was the first and last election in Eritrea. He would constantly schedule elections and then cancel them. The last time he did that, I believe, was in 2011. There's a really interesting interview with him with Al Jazeera that's still on YouTube, where the interviewer just asked him, when is there going to be an election? And he says with the straightest face, "What election?" And goes on to say that it depends on your definition of election, and that Eritrea will most likely not have an election for 3 or 4 decades. And the interviewer goes like, "Did you say 3 or 4 decades?" And he goes, "Well, maybe more. Who knows?" So that kind of gives you an idea of what the political situation is like in Eritrea. It's nicknamed the North Korea of Africa. It has, I think it's ranked like the worst human rights abuses in the world. There are tens of thousands of people imprisoned. There's people who have been imprisoned since Eritrea gained independence. And, it's one of those places where once you go in, you don't go out. At least you don't go out alive, right? There is no freedom of the press. All of the press is state-controlled. All of the media is state-controlled. They have a mandatory military service that all men and women in Eritrea have to serve. I think it's like 6 years of military service, and they're on active duty until they're 50, I believe. Something like that. But some people who fled the country, because of course many, many people fled once this policy came into being. People who've gone through this say that it's more of like a 6-year minimum, and you're only really released when your commander says you can be released. Also, interestingly, it's around like late teenage years, like your high school senior year, where there is a mandatory, like an erosion prevention task force where for a year you go out into the deserty regions up here and collect rocks and build like walls and things to prevent desertification. And that's what you spend your last year of your teenage years doing. These measures are said to promote, love for the country and unity among its people. But most people say it's just, most people, I mean people who have lived here and fled, say that it's just a form of brainwashing. And the government and Afwerki claim that any of the news about human rights abuses and so on and so forth are completely fabricated by the Western media. So that's pretty much where Eritrea is today. I was really shocked to read those statistics and find that there's a country with worse human rights abuses than North Korea. And in terms of freedom of the press, it's the third worst behind North Korea and Turkmenistan. Just really shocking that that's what this government has come to. So who knows what's going to happen to Eritrea in the future, how long this regime will last. It's the kind of power where, a coup could take over. The leader could rule until he's 80 years old. We don't know. We don't know what will happen to this country in the future. But they have greatly improved a lot of infrastructure and greatly improved their health. Like the overall health of Eritreans is greatly improved. They've eliminated a lot of diseases that are common throughout most of Africa, especially in this area. And there's just a lot of good healthcare in the country. They've really focused on that. But, at what expense? So, I'm going to wrap it up there for the night. That's it for Eritrea for now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very good